Hey guys, it's Frederik from the FWX podcast. I've been talking quite a lot now about specific kind of rhetoric and techniques and names about storytelling. And I have another video right here, right now for you. And I'm gonna talk, like I've done before, about this amazing TV series, Game of Thrones. And so I've been talking in these past videos about what makes the show so unique, and I have yet another one of those things to talk to you about. And I'm gonna use one of those special phrases that we use in storytelling and stories, and that is the phrase "kill your darlings," which means that when you have a character go through an arc, there are several moments, a conflict, or a romance, or a dance with death, meaning close to die or and not to die. There's also this phrase, kill your darlings, to mean that at some point they do have to die. And you can choose that how to do that yourself. And in this show, that happens a lot, an awful lot, because there's so many characters to trace and track. That's the same thing, but what I mean is that not everyone gets to live in the end. And so there are many specific deaths and in different ways, because there's people that get killed, there's people that get assassinated, there's people that get fall ill or specific kind of kills. And so I'm going to talk about that right now, because that makes this show pretty unique. And I also want to mention right here that George, I saw 2 interviews where he says that I do this so that you can feel the characters, so that you can feel how much they impact you and how my stories impact you. And he did that in a place in Australia. Was one of the interviews that I saw of him where he talked about you do kill a lot of people in your books. And so that also happens in the show. And that's what I'm going to talk about right now. And I'm going to start talking about this right now. But first, I want to mention that you can like this video if you like this kind of content. You can also subscribe to the channel if you would like more of this kind of content, and so that I can keep creating it for you. Also, you can share this with friends and family and people at work or here online. Also, you can comment in the comment section about it, but please do keep it polite and friendly. And we'll start right now by talking about all the significant and pivotal moments from the characters dying in Game of Thrones. This very show. And of course, at some point, I will also talk about this guy right now, right there, Eddard Ned Stark. But first, I want to pull out the big one, of course, and that is, of course, the Red Wedding. So the Red Wedding, first and foremost, is takes place in the last episode, the penultimate episode of the third season. I'm trying to get it straight here. So the Red Wedding happens in an episode called The Reigns of Castamere, which is the 9th episode of the third season. And this is a very emotional moment for so many of the characters, because quite a few of them die in this moment. And you really feel it when you see this episode. And what effectively happens is that Rob is losing his men. And he needs a new ally, so he's turning to the phrase. But then here at the Red Wedding, at Walter Frey's command, along with somebody else, he and his top people all get killed. And that also includes, like in the books, the dire wolf that Rob has. And it results in the death, like I already said, of definitely Rob, but then also people like, well, and this is different from the books in the show, his wife, who is pregnant with their child, and then also his mother, Rob's mother, Catelyn, and then several of his bannermen as well. And it is so gory. The reason why it's called the Red Wedding is because a lot of blood flowed that night. And so it's a pivotal moment that you absolutely feel in your core when you watch this episode. And so this is in the episode The Reigns of Castamere, which is episode 9 of the 3rd season. And also, the reason why it's also called a wedding is that one of those bannermen that Rob has is Admiral Tully, who is marrying Rosalind Frey, which is one of the daughters of Walder Frey. And I think that's enough for this pretty significant and pivotal moment from the show, which is also that gives you the result of 2 and more significant deaths. That being especially Robb Stark, his mother, and his direwolf. And there's of course more. Those being the Bannermen. Okay, I feel that's enough information for right now. Okay, I think you'll like this next one. I especially love what happened in this death, and I'm talking about Joffrey's death, and that happens in episode The Lion and the Rose, which is the 2nd episode of season 4. And I'll tell you a little what happens. So, during the reception of his marriage to Marjorie Tyrell of House Tyrell, he gets poisoned wine into his system. And this whole time during this reception, he is also trying to mock and torment his uncle, Tyrion, the half-man, the imp. And as it happens in the show, there's a person called the Strangler and he was smuggled into the event because he had. I'm gonna look this up as I'm talking. So, the Strangler has a very rare poison on him. Wait, I think I'm. Ah, excuse me. I wasn't getting it for a moment. So, the poison itself is called the Strangler. I thought for a moment because of that name that it was a person, but no. The poison itself is called the Strangler. And so this thing got into the event, the reception, to Joffrey's wedding. I'll rephrase. So, the poison, the Strangler, was smuggled into the event and ultimately ended up in his chalice that he was drinking out of. And it was given, the chalice was given to him by Olenna Tyrell, who is another member of that family. But initially, Tyrion is blamed for Joffrey's murder. Only later, we get to reveal that the real killers were Olenna and Peter Baelish as well. And this is much later that we come to know this. But, of course, what makes this so interesting is that Joffrey, for all this time, has had this build-up of his arc. And we learn that he is just a spiteful little brat with Lannister blood actually inside him. Just like the other two siblings that he has, Tommen and Marcella, who also die. And I might talk about that later. And yeah, like I said, this actor that played Joffrey played him to such an incredible extent that he was actually even loathed for doing his role so well, and also resulting into Joffrey being very loathed, both in universe and by us, the fans, because, well, if you make up a character like that, it's got to be a satisfying death for him. And so he gets poisoned, which, and it's portrayed so brilliantly because at first it just starts to get cough, and it gets pretty. I'll rephrase. At first, he has all the symptoms of what seems like I have a cough, but then that cough won't stop and start to get worse and worse and worse to the point that everybody rushes around him and he dies in his mother's arms, into Cersei's arms. And it's both horrible and fascinating and full of angst for him because he's only just a teen in this show. But because he is so vile, so loathsome, that we get such an emotional scene with him, resulting in his demise. And given what he has done before, sparking the War of Five Kings with the beheading of Ned Stark, is really something to behold. Yes. Okay, I think that's enough to talk about this specific death. One more thing that I want to mention here is that this also leads to another death, which I will talk about in a moment. Alright. And I'll talk about that one right now. So, this leads to Tyrion getting his trial for supposedly killing Joffrey. But this leads to him facing his accusers in the court, and we get also that amazing scene from Peter Dinklage as Tyrion, giving the performance of a lifetime basically, as he craps on everyone, metaphorically of course, in that court, and he gives an amazing speech. And I get it in my head, and I kind of know how to say it, but I'm not going to do it because you really need to see that for yourself, basically. And that leads to him killing his father, which is the next death I want to talk about. So, Tywin has always been the patriarch of the Lannister family, has always cared about its legacy and the perception of the family. And ultimately, as Tyrion escapes with the help of his brother from Jaime, he sets out into the castle of the Red Keep to find his father, who is on the shitter, the toilet, and they have a conversation as Tyrion is holding him back with a crossbow. Couldn't find the word for a moment. Unbelievable. So Tyrion finds his father taking a shit, and they have a talk. Tyrion threatens him. Tywin tries to make sure that Tyrion gets why he did what he did. And of course, this also has to do with the fact that Tyrion, despite all his privilege and fame and wealth and paramoureship, I would call it, is always been belittled for being the stature that he has. And so, not only does Tyrion find his father on the toilets, he finds that the woman that he loved, Shay, is in his father's bed. And he is absolutely pissed at this, which leads to him having a confrontation with his father and finally killing him with the crossbow. Which leads to the son killing the father. And Tywin is hit in his torso, in the middle of his upper body, and it doesn't take too long for him to die after that. And that follows Tyrion as he escapes King's Landing, and Varys goes with him, while the death of the Lannister patriarch comes to know to people as bells are tolling in the city, leading to a real turning point for the Lannisters, because the family is so divided right now. Because the youngest killed the father, Jaime is back, but not at all so content with all of it. Same thing for Cersei, which leads to actually a kind of ironic reversal of what happened with the Starks. Only not all of their family are dead at this point, because this takes place in the episode The Children which is the last episode of season 4, episode 10. Okay, I feel that's enough information about this one. I'm going to talk about another very significant kill and death, in this case, an assassination. One which is very gutsy to do. And of course, I'm talking about Jon Snow. And at the very end of season 5, in the episode called Mother's Mercy, he is assassinated by his own Night's Watch. So, here's what happened. So, Jon had been making quite a few decisions. They were very poor, and they were a bad taste for the Night's Watch, which led to quite a few of them luring him into a trap, and there several of those watchmen stab him to death. And that includes in the show also a young boy called Ollie, who delivers the final blow straight to Jon's heart. And the reasoning for them to do this is that, especially that older person present, Alistair Thorne, who had been, pun intended, a thorn in Jon's side, believed that Jon was doing all the wrong things. Like, for instance, fraternizing with the wildlings that he brought south of the wall and into the castle, Black itself. And that, of course, leaves us with Jon supposedly dead. But this does not stop, as we later learn that the Red Priestess Melisandre she comes to Castle Black, and she, in the next season, in season 6, brings him back to life. Jon is resurrected. And yeah, I think the interesting part here is that I've talked about Tywin's death and Joffrey's and the Red Wedding too. These are all forms of revenge, basically. And this one, the assassination of Jon Snow, could be seen as that too. But of course, given that Jon, just like Tywin, like Joffrey, and the Starks too, is in a position of power, it can be seen as an assassination. But because the difference being that the Starks at the Red Wedding were taken up by another house, because Robb wouldn't honor his promise to the House Frey for marrying Walder Frey's daughter. Difference with especially Tyrion and Tywin too, because we're seeing actually a family moment happen where the son kills the father. So I think this qualifies as an assassination, and sort of resembling what happens to Julius Caesar in our own present history. And I mean present as in real life. Because Julius Caesar was also stabbed to death. Way more than Jon Snow is, I think. And that reason also why I say it resembles what happened to Julius Caesar is because one of the people present at his death was someone he knew quite well, Brutus. And he also says, but the phrase is, et tu, Brutus. You too, Brutus. And so I think it resembles that in quite a similar way. And so that's an interesting one to talk about, of course. And okay, so that's quite an interesting and absolutely pivotal moment for the show and the story going forwards. Especially because John also comes back to life. He's resurrected. Okay, let's talk about the next big death. Well, I say big because this next one really got me in the feels. The others did too, but this one is a special one. And I'm talking about the death of Lyanna Mormont during the Long Night episode, which is episode 3 of season 8, which is during the Battle of Winterfell. And so, like every other hero that is present at the Battle of Winterfell, she fights along. And she is killed by one of those wights that Night King has under his control, under his command. And this giant thing, picks her up and crushes her. But in a last effort, she stabs the giant with a dragon glass dagger, which kills it, because they can't stand the point of that. And the reason why I find this a significant death to be The reason why I find this to be a significant death is because that actress, Bella Ramsey, really, really shows off what she can. Because she had that amazing scene before as well where she pledged her allegiance to the King of the North, to Jon Snow. And so I find it's a lesser death compared to the others, but still quite impactful because she gives such an amazing performance. Okay, that's enough for her death, I feel. Let's talk about another one, quite interesting one, which could also be seen as an assassination. And this is also tied to what happens with the Red Wedding. And I'm talking about the death of Walder Frey, who, by the way, was played in this show by the same actor who played Argus Filch on Harry Potter. And so it happens in the show, and I believe in the story from the books too, is that a sort of reversal of the Red Wedding happens, where he is present in his dining hall along with a good couple of others, and Arya has been trained by the assassins on that island of Bravos by the guy with the really tough name. And so she shows up. She has heard what has happened about the Red Wedding, and she disguises herself as someone serving in the castle and stews up a pie for Walder Frey and confronts him. And also, pretty grueling to say this, but this isn't any pie. Because as we see in the show, he removes a piece of it and he sees a finger in there. Because this pie is made of his own blood. His son's were killed, and Arya made the spy out of them. Well, we don't see that exact moment, but that is how it is presented to us. Because she says something along the line of, "How does it taste?" And we get the kill of Walder Frey as Arya reveals who she is and slits Walder Frey's throat. And this is, of course, revenge from her for his plot with the Lannisters for killing her brother and mother, along with so many others. So, given the situation that this is in, with Arya still being a Stark, you could see this as revenge, but then also the way in which it happens, her being there, everyone's distracted. He has that moment where he sees like, oh damn, there's a finger in this pie. She shows herself and slits his throat. Could very well be seen as an assassination, because Arya has literally been trained to be one by that guy with the really tough name that I'm not gonna pronounce. And yeah, she kills him as revenge. But because of the situation, I kind of see this as both. It's potentially an assassination, but it's really revenge because what Walder Frey has done to her family. Okay, let's continue with the next significant death I want to talk about here. And this is significant. Hold up a second, I think I didn't mention what episode this happened in. Oh yes, so in the first episode of season 7 is when this happens, by the way. Okay, let's move on to the next death that I want to talk about here. And that is of Daenerys' brother, which is very early on in the show, in episode 6 of season 1, called A Golden Crown, which is a literal description of what happens with Viserys. But first I'm going to give you more information about what happened. So, Viserys, despite being a Targaryen who has a royal blood and a claim to the Iron Throne, has been nothing. Actually, now I think about it, pretty similar to Joffrey in terms of behavior, being a petulant child, basically, a teenager, I believe, and an absolute brat and a thief with a giant lust for power. And he gets his served as he draws a sword to Khal Drogo, as both of them are present with Daenerys in Vaz Dofrak, and I hope I pronounced that right. And this is a serious breach of the law in the Dothraki city. And Khal Drogo is, of course, extremely angry by this because it's such a huge disrespect. So as his men, the Dothraki, restrain Viserys and gets all the gold medallions from Viserys that he's been holding on to on his belt. And Khal Drogo, by the way, I should say, Yeah, I want to mention here for a moment that this was one of the first roles that I saw Jason Momoa in. The same thing for Emilia Clarke in her role as Daenerys Targaryen. Yes. Um, but significant here is, of course, the name of the episode being a literal one. Because Khal Drogo decides that. Well, let me read you. Let me tell you a little more about what happens here. Is that Viserys is so angry, extremely angry, because he's not getting what he wants. He has all the ambition, he has all the motivation and the lust for power, but he's so snobby and stupid, not to mention privileged. And so Khal Drogo says, "You want a crown? I will give you a crown." And so he has the gold from him melted down. And as soon as that is ready, Khal turns for a moment to Daenerys and says, well, I'm going a bit too fast here for a moment. So Khal agrees that, okay, fine, you should get a crown. And so the gold gets molten into something, and Khal takes this thing on both sides and pours it over Viserys' head, finally fulfilling the fact that Viserys wanted a golden crown of sorts. And Daenerys is watching this, watching the death of her brother, and also says he was no dragon, which is a pretty cool remark to say about your own brother in the show specifically, because the Targaryens have their bonds with their dragons, but Viserys did not have it. Did not have it exactly, the X factor, the thing to really be a king or a ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. He did not have it. And this also signifies a turning point for Daenerys as she becomes a bit more acceptant of the brutality of things. And also her embracing the Dothraki culture more. And being willing to kill people. And Khal is the one that does it, but she does agree with doing it, actually. And especially when you see that happen in the show, it is a pretty crazy death. Okay. I feel that's enough to talk about this death. And okay. Alright, let's talk about this next death that I want to talk about. And that is Renly Baratheon's. And what I want to mention first is that at the very beginning of the show, we learn of all the different houses, the Starks, the Lannisters, the Boltons, and many more. But one thing we can't forget is that these families are pretty big. And they include lots of children, lots of brothers and sisters, and Renly is one of those. He belongs to House Baratheon. He is brother to Stannis and Robert. and he is killed. Also, in a pretty weird way, because in episode 5 of season 2, we see his death. And one of the things that's specifically weird about this is who does it. Also, the name of this episode is called The Ghost of Harrenhal. And so the thing that does it is a shadow creature that Red Priestess Melisandre conjures up. Or, as you can see in the show, gives birth to, basically. Which was also incredibly weird. And quite distraught. Yeah. And this is part of the creature that came about, this shadow, is a consequence of the use of dark magic between Stannis and Melisandre. But it's what makes it so different in terms of other pivotal scenes with a death is that this leads to a lot of consequences to the political landscape of Westeros. Because Renly was about to join into marriage, or already was at this point, and it all ties it together in some way. And it's, yeah, the very thing about it is that because it's done by something that is not human, that makes it very weird in terms with the other deaths. Because if you look at them, a family dispute between a father and a son with Tyrion and Tywin, of course it's much more than a dispute, of course. It's basically a revenge kill with political ramifications. And in a way you could see it like that too with Renly. Is that the product of Stannis and Melisandre killed him so that they didn't have to get their hands all dirty. No need for a knife or a poison, but you have something that does it. Yes, that's the key component about his death, I feel. And that brings kind of a tie between the Baratheons and the Tyrells, and gives us a moment with them instead of the Starks and the Lannisters, who clearly steal the show. Although the Tyrells to some extent also do that. And I'm gonna talk about that in a moment too. But first I'm gonna talk about yet another death that is pretty familial too. And I'm talking now about Lysa Arryn and what happens with her. So, and this has everything to do with Peter Baelish, who had always been a close friend to the Arryns and the Starks, especially those two sisters, Lysa and Catelyn. And the books give more information about what his ties to them exactly are, but in the show it's kind of vague. Like, did he actually desire them, or did he just want them as friends? I feel that's a bit unclear to me. And what exactly happens here is that he orchestrates this because he has been manipulating Lysa into believing that her niece, Sansa in this case, was a threat to her because she could be a what's the word? She could carry basically the stewardship or the lordship or whatever kind of leadership role as an Arryn and Stark child. Yes. And the scene we get to see with Peter and Lysa is that at that very point at the moon door, and their little finger confessed to Lysa that he has always loved Catelyn, and finally pushes her through the moon door. And the whole reason why he wanted to do this is so that he could have power in the Vale. And also what came before this is that Lysa saw a kiss that Peter gave to Sansa, which made Lysa angry, incredibly angry. But this was actually a calculated move by him, which leads to him having control over the Vale and its military power. And I say this, the military power part, because in the previous video that when I talked about the battles, the Vale Knights end up saving Jon Snow's ass at the Battle of the Bastards. So when you look at it in that way, it all neatly ties into it. Okay, I feel like that's enough information about this death. So very much could also be seen yet again as a family dispute, which is actually just a calculated move by Peter Baelish, as his saying is, chaos is a ladder. And he instigates that chaos by doing very risky moves that could give him more power. Alright, let's talk about the next death. And this is of another family member. I'm going back and forth here between the families basically. I talked about Renly before. I haven't talked about Stannis yet. So, in the show... Oh, hold on. I haven't said yet what episode this happens in. The death of Lysa. This is in the 7th episode of season 4 of the show of Game of Thrones, and it's titled Mockingbird. Ending with Littlefinger pushing Lysa Arryn through the moon door, resulting in him getting power in the Vale. Yes. Okay, let's go to Stannis and what happens to him. So, the person to do it to Stannis is Brienne of Tarth, Gwendolyn Christie's character. And this is also yet another revenge kill, as she was very close with his brother, Renly, and fought for him, and is thought to be one of the most strongest and powerful knights in the Seven Kingdoms. Brienne of Tarvis, I mean. And this happened shortly after the Battle of the Bastards, and Stannis has been having some bad moments himself as he has lost his daughter Shireen in that ritual that Melisandre was also part of. And he is deserted by many of his soldiers. And this ultimately leads to him being alone with Brienne. And he himself is wounded. And he confesses to her that he used blood magic to kill Renly, which leads to her not just upright sword to the heart or to the stomach or to the face, to the neck. She beheads him. And yet another satisfying death, I feel, because, yeah, like I said, it's a revenge kill, because Brienne was close with Renly, who she trusted also. And this is also part of her arc of becoming a woman knight. And she gets to avenge Renly. I should also mention, of course, the episode that this takes place in. It's called Mother's Mercy. The 10th episode of season 5. And this is also a death that they specifically did for the show, because it's not in the books. Most of the deaths that I've talked before are actually in the books. Alright, I feel that's enough information for his death. Okay, and the next one I've talked about before, and this is kind of the consequences of a bigger action. So at some point we come to learn about the Sparrows and their leader, played by Jonathan Pryce, and that leads to the brainwashing of the other Tyrell members, that includes Marjorie and Loras. And this is basically there's a specific term that I'm thinking of, I'll just call it the consequences of the consequences. So after the manipulation of the Tyrells, they join the Sparrows. They become a freer version of themselves and reside with Jonathan Pryce's character. The High Sparrow. And this leads to the death of Tommen, who is the second Lannister child of Jaime and Cersei. born of incest. The meeker of the two brothers. And after Joffrey died, they looked for a new heir, and that went to Tommen, of course. And he and Marjorie wed. They had a marriage, and they were supposed to have children, but then the High Sparrows came in with their ways, their old ways, making their old ways new ways, and instituting new laws according with faith, especially the Seven. And this leads to Tommen, distraught by the death of his wife and the other Tyrells during the wildfire that claims their lives in the Sept. And he decides that I've had enough of all of this. I will no longer any part of this. And because the destruction of the Great Sept with all those deaths, he decides to take his own life, and he jumps from the Red Keep, resulting in yet another Lannister death. And he himself had also been tried to be manipulated by the High Sparrow and by his family and the others. So he's completely at a loss of what to do, very much in despair, which leads to him jumping and killing himself. Which now leads to Cersei being the sole ruler of the Seven Kingdoms. And she gets to sit on the Iron Throne. I'm checking something just in between for a moment. There's two more significant deaths that I want to talk about now. Two very significant deaths. But first, the one that leads to the finale. And that is, of course, with the Night King, who we've also seen the necessary flashbacks of how he came to be, that being with one of the very first men to arrive and have contact with the children of the forest, who shoved an ice dagger into him and he became the Night King. And so the Night King has arisen along with his army and the Night Walkers, and that finally leads him to a campaign of blood and ice. And finally that leads to him at Winterfell with his army, as he is going after Bran to try and take out the one with all the knowledge. Because Bran, as now the free-eyed raven, has lured the Night King to the weirwood forest, which is a significant place because that is where he became the Night King. And his way of dying seals the deal. And it happens with Arya and that Valyrian dagger that she's been holding on to. Because let me set you the scene. So, there's the Battle of Winterfell, or there was another name for that one. gonna look that up for just a second. Oh, and by the way, this is in episode 3 of season 8, called The Long Night. Yeah, that's the other name for it, The Long Night. And I was sitting in the scene. So, during the battle, the White Walkers and their troops, the Whites, the undead people, arrive at Winterfell. They have a huge battle with the other forces, the Dothrakis, the different families and their warriors and soldiers, and all the other heroes are present. And the Night King finds himself inside the walls, coming to the Weirwood Forest to take Bran out, to kill him. And as everything around is going into flame and ice, Arya comes out of nowhere like a skilled assassin and plunges the Valyrian steel into the Night King. And we see this in the show as that he captures her for a moment and she drops that knife, only to catch him with her other hand and stab him in the stomach, which effectively ends the threat of the White Walkers and the undead forces that they were holding. And the Night King bursts into many different particles of ice, and his death kind of resembles a little like how Voldemort dies in the last scenes of the Harry Potter, the Deathly Hallows Part 2 film, where he also evaporates. And so the Night King has a similar moment. I don't know how it happens in the books, but now that I've reminded myself of the fact that this is also similar to how Voldemort dies, I'm not so sure if this was such a great idea. But nevertheless, this is a moment, a very pivotal moment, because it's no more White Walkers from this point on, and that leads, well, to the political imbalance between what is left of the houses in the Seven Kingdoms, the families that are still scribbling and squabbling amongst each other about who should be having all this power, who should be sitting on the Iron Throne, while somebody already sits on the Iron Throne, Cersei. And there is one more person I want to talk about who sets all of this off. And that is, of course, person known for dying on screen quite a lot. And it's Sean Bean as Ned Stark. And so in season 1 we get to see all the different houses. We get the necessary exposition of what the world and the lore is like. And we find out that, from his perspective, by the way, Ned is the one that finds out what is actually happening in the King's Landing, that the children of Cersei and Robert Baratheon are actually not Robert's children, that they're Tyrion incest. Why did I say it like that? I meant that these children were born of incest between Jaime and Cersei. And Ned learns this, and he has been doing such a tight investigation. Well, not that tight actually, because as I've talked about in my video about duels, there is the one that he has with Jaime outside Peter Baelish's accommodation, shall we call it? By the way, this is a weird way to say it, given of all the other deaths and other things I've talked about now. Which, by the way, is also part of all the candidness and, on occasion, lewdness as well. And I have another video about that, which you can watch after this one. But what I mentioned about this one is that this leads to Ned getting discovered by the Lannisters, specifically the parents, and which results in that fight with Jaime outside that whorehouse of Peter Baelish, and he is brought before the king, and that is Joffrey at this point, because Robert has died, and Joffrey sets this whole thing off by having Ned killed. In fact, he is sentenced to be beheaded because, so he's accused of three. I'm gonna rephrase for a moment. So after Ned finds out that those kids are not of Cersei and Robert, and he finds out that it was the product of incest, he's imprisoned and is forced to confess, despite not being guilty of treason, which leads to an open execution as Joffrey tasks one of his men to take Ned's head. And this is where I want to point out for a moment that phrase that I started this conversation with, kill your darlings. There's nothing bigger than killing one of your lead men. And men, I mean in the broadest of ways. Your main character is what I mean. Because for all of season 1, you see the arc that Ned has, learning what is actually happening, and that leads to the rest of all the other seasons, of course, from the end of season 1, because this is the episode it takes place in, episode 10th of season 1, called Baelor. And this is also an important point to mention here, is that as Ned is brought to Joffrey and his entourage, which is a fancy word for saying everyone of his court, in his case a real king's court, which includes also, by the way, the supposed future queen, his own daughter Sansa, is present, and she's desperately pleading with Joffrey for like not doing this. And also Arya is apparently also present, and she's hiding underneath a statue. And Ned, before he gets to Joffrey, he mentions to his last man that he has, and mentions the name of Baelor, which is basically code for Arya is here. Make sure she does not see it. And as he is brought before Joffrey, we get that person of his with Arya, and he shields her from seeing this happen as the crowd is asking for it to happen. And that leads to his very untimely death with a beheading. And there's much more that happens with his body and his head afterwards. Like, for instance, he gets put on a spike at the Red Keep. And later, Joffrey forces Sansa to go and see her father's head. And that gets us to the point where the whole first season has set up everything that we need to know going forward to the rest of the other seasons. And that is where I want to end this episode of the FWX episode on. But before I go, I want to mention that I really like doing this kinds of videos, and I would love for you to like this video, subscribe to the channel if you like this kind of content. You can also talk about it in the comment section if you like. And please also share this with friends and family and people here online or on social media if you like. You can also follow me on social media. I do also put the promo for this information out, that new episodes are out. And so thank you so much for sitting through this. I'm Frederik, this is the FWX podcast, and I will see you in the next episode.